virtually everybody either grew up in Brooklyn or knows someone, so it's like 6 degrees of separation, so that's fine. But in any event, so this is on the cover of the book. It's my parents. My mother is still around. She's 91. We just celebrated her 91st birthday, September 23rd. She doesn't like television. She says she's too busy. Which she is, actually. And that's my dad. He passed away a few years ago. And that's me, at 2 years old, I guess. And then, of course, he's the iconic Brooklyn. And so anyway, this book is about me growing up in the 50s, but also about the 50s, which has become actually a very interesting period of time for college students to study, and finding that there were courses not only in the 60s, which of course you might imagine, but now there are also courses in the 50s, because the 50s begat the 60s, begat the materialism that we're living with today. In the 50s, this country really made things back then. Today we buy things we don't need with money we don't have. But back in the 50s, Europe was destroyed by the war. The agents really weren't making things. I mean, China wasn't the power it was. It was in this country, it was the manufacturing base. We were making products for the world. So unions were strong, the middle class was strong, the economy was great. Living standards were high. It was a wonderful time. Gasoline was cheap. I mean, they had these big iconic 50s cars with the huge fins at the end, and Cadillac Eldorado with amazing fins. Just an interesting time. But what I did in the book is I wrote about my childhood in the 50s, these are remembrances, and I also wrote about what was happening in the 50s. So let me start with the introduction to the book. My mother labored for 40 hours alone before I entered the world on March 7, 1946, at the Fort Totten Army Hospital in Queens County, New York. My father told her when she went into the hospital, giving birth is no big deal. Millions of women all over the world do it each day. I'll drop by as soon as I get a chance. My grandmother was furious when she learned of my father's remark. She said to him, I never would have let your grandfather speak that way to me, particularly to the first child. Despite his sometimes gruff attitude, my father truly cared for my mother. When he proposed to her, he said that she was more precious to him than his stamp collection. My Aunt Sylvia told me when she heard this story that she knew it was true love, since nothing was dearer to her brother than his stamps. My father left the Army in 1947, and our family moved to a small one-bedroom apartment 2 blocks from Ebbets Field, the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Growing up, I spent many blissful summer afternoons waiting to catch foul balls that were hit out of that ballpark. My brother and 2 sisters did not share my interest in baseball. What we all did share was one bedroom with 4 beds. Mom and Dad slept on a rollaway cot in the living room. My family lived in that one-bedroom apartment for 10 years, and in a 2-bedroom apartment in the same building for 6 years after that. They were among the happiest years of my life. And actually, I have some illustrations of the book, and in the middle of the book, this is me standing in front of the apartment building. This is on page, I guess.
Nice looking building.
It was a good looking building with a doorman.
That's right, Deco style.
That's right, Deco style. All the buildings on the block were Deco style, pre-war.
Beautiful. High
ceilings, big rooms. They made them into co-ops today. They're really expensive. Although the neighborhood had a real decline back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And now it's on the upswing, as is a lot of the rest of Brooklyn. Brooklyn's become sort of a hot spot. Young people today are living in Williamsburg, Park Slopes, big, Cobble Hill. Bedford-Stuyvesant now is undergoing renovation. It's just, it's a hot spot. Coney Island, which was really run down, now coming back. So, leave Westhampton, move to Brooklyn. I don't think so. There's a picture of Ebbets Field here, the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers. The Brooklyn Dodgers actually moved to Los Angeles.
That was dramatic.
That's
1957. I actually, right, and I gave up rooting for any team. I said, it's a business. I thought it was more than that, but no. And the Giants moved to San Francisco just a few months after that, after the Brooklyn Dodgers moved out. So New York lost both teams. But we have the Mets. In any event, I also write about the 50s. Here's something America in the 1950s. some of this you may not know about, but some of it you might. Some believe that life in the 1950s was an idyllic time in American history. While that may have been true for lots of white Americans, it was not the case for the majority of black Americans. Segregation and racism abounded, although there was some movement in the opposite direction, like the 1954 Brown versus Board of Ed Supreme Court decision that ruled segregated public schools unconstitutional. Moreover, gays were wedged tight in the closet, and numerous women marked time at home when they really wanted to be out doing other things. In The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan noted that many suburban housewives took tranquilizers like cough drops in the 1950s to dull feelings of anxiety about the pointlessness of their lives. But many Americans felt upbeat about the country. Discharged soldiers were attending college with the GI Bill, and after they graduated, they were finding jobs in large companies, getting married, having children, buying cars, and moving to the suburbs. There and in the cities, families gathered around the living room TV set to watch situation comedies that celebrated the virtues of family living and advertisements that hyped wondrous new products to make such living easier and better. Most individuals trusted the government and had faith in their leaders. They also had faith in the nation's economic system, which was characterized by high levels of employment and relatively low inflation. From 1950 to 1958, the economy had a steady high growth rate of 4.7%, almost 5% a year. Would we like to have that now? And people had faith in God. A greater percentage of Americans attended church in the 50s than in any other time in U.S. history. In 1954, Congress added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the next year mandated "in God we trust" on all U.S. currency. So next time you take out a bill and look for "in God we trust," it was put there in the 50s. Television and AM radio were immensely popular. Through these media, rock and roll, the music of youth, sex, and rebellion, reached millions of teenagers, leading them to become freer and more independent than their parents had ever been as adolescents. Elvis Presley became a cultural icon. American Bandstand became the launching pad for dozens of top 40 pop music stars. Clothing and grooming styles evolved. Boys wore sideburns, slicked back their hair, and donned jeans and leather jackets with upturned collars to be cool. Girls sported ponytails, poodle skirts, pedal pushers, and scarves. Bigger busts and smaller waistlines a la Marilyn Monroe were all the rage. Sock hops, hula hoops, and cruising emerged as inactivities, and kids developed their own slang with words and expressions like squares, chicks, going ape, bebop, backseat bingo, which was kissing in the backseat, hip, can't do that anymore, of course, hip, which is cool, and Big Daddy, which is an older person. Many of the words had "ville" added to them. They were Squaresville, Coolsville, Weirdsville, Dutiesville, Deadsville, etc. Despite their newfound freedom and autonomy, young people, for the most part, still behaved and were expected to behave respectfully towards adults. Females were required to comport themselves in a ladylike manner. Males were obliged to conduct themselves like gentlemen. Premarital sex was frowned upon. If a young woman became pregnant, she might be sent to a special school for girls or shipped off to live with out-of-town relatives. While changes took place through the 1950s, massive societal shifts didn't occur until the 1960s, a decade which saw a huge swing in ethical values, family life, race relations, and confidence in government. To some, that is why the 50s are considered an idyllic time, an era when families and social standards were basically intact and life was less complicated and more enjoyable. And many people feel that way. And things were cheaper. Well, right. What did things cost in 1950? I have a list year from 1950 to 1959 by year. What did a car cost? A new car cost in 1950?
2,000, I saw.
Not bad, 1750.
All right.
Gas, 27 cents a gallon. So you could have these big cars. A home, 14.5. We're heading there, but hopefully. Bread, 14 cents a loaf. Postage stamps, 3 cents. The Dow Jones stock market, 235. I won't say we're headed there, hopefully not. Average annual salary, $3,800.
if a man made $10,000, he was a rich guy then.
That's right.
Because my brother worked
Very
for the
rich
tailor
guy.
shop, he found out in his pocket of the guy's pants, and they said, oh my God, is he rich, the richest in the neighborhood.
Oh, because he worth $10,000?
He made $10,000 a year.
Oh, yeah, he was doing well. He was living large. Yeah, no, it was true. But people had the opportunity, you know, money was to be made in the fifties. Also, if you didn't want to, start a business or, go into stock brokerage or whatever else you do to make lots of money, you get a job in the company and you were pretty sure you'd have lifetime employment. I mean, you joined a union, like in the car companies. I mean, General Motors, Chrysler, particularly General Motors really ran the country almost. I mean, they was such a huge corporation, and the union contracts were incredibly good. And when you join General Motors, you figure you had the job 20, 30 years, no problem. It was only, recently where all the problems the unions developed. But in any event, but it was also an interesting time. It's like right in the back of the book, the 50s had, rock and roll, beatniks. Do you remember the beatniks, anybody?
The beatniks?
Yeah, Jack Kerouac, these sort of down in Greenwich Village.
Oh, yeah.
There's a famous novel, On the Road. It sort of just come back. Allen Ginsberg, I think they made a movie about that.
Yeah, but you were too young to be in the village then.
I know, I wasn't, I had a friend of mine, though. I had a friend, a kid that lived below me, maybe you know the name, Alan J. Weberman. He got famous as a little bit older. He went through Bob Dylan's garbage.
Oh, yeah.
Dylan threw out his garbage, and Weberman, when he was a teenager, he would go into the city where Dylan was living, rip open the garbage, and look through the garbage to find out what Dylan was throwing out, to write about him. And Weberman became famous as starting a new profession of garbology. Which makes some sense. You go to people's garbage and see what's going on. And he became an expert on Dylan. And he actually gained some notoriety. I looked him up recently. He got a Wikipedia entry, he's written some books, so. But he had, back in the 50s, the beatniks wore dark, turtlenecks, the black turtlenecks, the berets. They smoked, which was a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, but some other things in the 50s. Rock and roll, beatniks, hula hoop started in the 50s. The Kinsey Report. Which was a big deal in terms of the sexual revolution we think of the 60s. But the 50s really begat the sexual revolution of the 60s. Playboy started in the 1950s. And who was the first Playmate of the Month? Marilyn Monroe. The Cold War back in the 50s, we were really scared of communism. It was thought that communism would take over the country. And of course, if you were growing up then, the idea was maybe they'd drop an atom bomb or a hydrogen bomb. So going to school back then, there were these take cover drills.
Right.
Duck and cover, you remember that?
We went under the tables.
Under the table.
And then sometimes in the hall, they took us to the hallway.
Right.
Where we stayed 10, 15 minutes.
Right. Duck and cover. And on the hallway, and you go against the wall.
I hated under the table because I was dirtying my pants. I
Right.
didn't want to crawl under the table. I didn't like that.
Right. I mean, we were lucky they didn't drop the bomb, but I don't think those things would have protected the kids.
No, I don't think.
But bureaucrats trying to protect themselves did the best they could. I'm not sure.
Stuff like with the cookies and everything, where we had we had that out here.
Which is
We were
what?
in our summer, we had to have some dried food. And
Oh,
we had
yeah.
cookies and everything, so that they would last when you're down there.
And did you have out your fallout shelters? I mean,
No.
in the cities,
Our basement.
the apartments in the cities, by the way, they still have signs if you go back into the cities in some of the
That's the
neighborhoods.
60s, the fallout shelters.
No, even in the late 50s, they were putting up signs.
And they put like cans of stuff in these buildings.
And then you
I
sell cookies, they would sell biscuits.
thought it's the 60s, but all right.
No, it's the 50s, and actually you see some of these signs with the yellow and black signs, fallout shelters. So
Yeah.
you know in the building, you could go out and have the fallout shelter.
Good.
The idea was the Russians would be coming and flying over and dropping the bombs, and this would protect us.
We
Of
could be
course,
safe eating that canned goods.
yeah, right, it's just a whole other world. But in any event, there's also the public school system, I write about in the book, going to public school in the 50s. that was really a terrific era for public school education. I mean, you know,